Good evening. This is Dr. David Battle here at Claflin University. It is my privilege to lead you through the biblical studies in this course on Introduction to Biblical Literature. And this is the first of the lectures dealing with biblical literature. Now we'll be dealing with biblical literature in two ways. We'll be looking at it both as an anthology, or actually two anthologies, and also as a canon. And we'll be specifically looking at the canonization of the Old Testament a little bit later on. But in this particular video, we'll be just looking at it as an anthology and as a religious canon, because those are two different aspects of the Bible. When we begin looking at the Bible, you'll discover that it has two anthologies in it. One anthology is the Old Testament and the other anthology is the New Testament. The anthology of the New Testament has 27 books in it, and the anthology of the Old Testament has 39 books in it, coming to a total collection of 66 books in our Protestant Bibles. Now, these works are quite varied. They were written over at least a 1,600 year period approximately. There are around 29 known credited authors, and you can think about some of these authors. You may know some or have heard of some. Moses is given credit for the writing of the Pentateuch, and then you have Joshua, and then you also have Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah, all major prophets of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have Matthew, and then there's Mark, and then there's Paul, and Peter, and Jude, and John, and these are all different authors who wrote different books that are found within the collections that we call the Bible, either in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. Now, as you know, the Bible was written in many different genres. Genres are types of literature, and I'm using genre here pretty much as you would have it in your English class. And there's different types. Most of the Pentateuch, or the opening of Genesis, is written in a historical narrative format, and so it kind of tells a story. You also have poetic passages throughout the Bible. Most times we think about poetry would be like the Psalms and other places. There are discourses like the Sermon on the Mount, and there's even a lot of legal material slightly within the Sermon on the Mount, but especially within the Pentateuch. You have a whole series of laws there presenting different aspects, different regulations and rules for the Iron Age society of ancient Israel. You also have genealogies listing families and the tracing of a certain lineage from one place to another, and also indicating the passage of time. In addition to that, there are oracles, and which are prophetic words, and then you have parables and so forth. There's a whole bunch of different types of literary genres within the Bible. In addition to that, the Bible was written in three different languages. The Old Testament, or the first collection of books that we have, was written in two languages, one language being Hebrew and the other language being Aramaic. And so these were different languages that are found in the Old Testament. Now the New Testament was written in Greek. That is why you use translations, because unless you've gone to seminary or had language studies, you probably only read English. You might read Spanish, French, German, or something else like that nowadays, but most people do not read Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic, and so you have to have some training there. One of the interesting things in the Bible is that it is the most published and most translated book in world history. I've known people who have been translating the Bible into a language in the Philippines called Ibanog. You may be familiar with various other languages, like it can be in Spanish, it can be in English, French, Portuguese, and a Portuguese friend of mine also calls another language Brazilian. It's similar to Portugal, it's Portuguese, but it's in all sorts of different languages. Swahili, it's been translated into all the major languages, and they are actually trying to get it translated into almost every dialect or every language that of the known world. Now, As we said earlier, there are two anthologies in the Bible, and these two anthologies are the Old Testament and the New Testament. And let's first look at the Old Testament. And the Old Testament has actually two forms. This anthology has two basic forms. One is the Christian Old Testament and the other is the Tanakh. Now, the thing that's slightly confusing here is that we're talking about the same thing. The difference is one is the Christian arrangement and the other is the Jewish arrangement. In other words, the Tanakh is the Jewish Bible. And they sometimes will call it the Torah, referring to the whole. But in this case, we're going to be a little bit more specific in our vocabulary. And so the Jewish Bible is called the Tanakh, and it's the content equivalent of what we have in our Bibles in the Old Testament. If you look there, you'll see the Tanakh has three major divisions. The first division is called Law or Torah, and that is basically the first 5 books of the Bible, what you could identify as the books of Moses. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In addition to that, you have the prophets. Now, going back to law and Torah, it's a little confusing because sometimes the word law or Torah can refer to the entire Old Testament, but more specifically it refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now we look at the prophets. Now the prophets are a little bit different from our category because they have the former prophets and the latter prophets. And the former prophets are basically the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, this kind of surprises us because we would not consider those books as prophetic, but the ancients do, and we'll be dealing with that in a later class period. In addition to that, there are the latter prophets. Now, the latter prophets are books that we're pretty familiar with, are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, as well as the 12 minor prophets. And so that's not too odd to us. And the last category is the writings. And the writings include basically your Psalms, Proverbs, and it also includes other works like Esther and Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. When we look at the Tanakh, it is actually divided in, has been arranged artistically. You first have the Torah, the books of the law, which is mostly narrative and legal material. Then you have the prophetic material, which first begins with narrative material that covers the history of Israel from the time of their entrance into the land until their exile. Or then you have the latter prophets, and these are mostly what we would consider prophetic and have prophetic statements in them. And then you have the writings, and the writings kind of counterbalance the prophets, and beginning with lyrical literature. Now, the lyrical literature includes both what we would call psalms and hymns and that sort of thing, as well as what we would call wisdom or philosophical. In the wisdom material, you have both the practical wisdom as well as philosophical or speculative wisdom. And then the writings conclude with a series of narrative works that primarily deal with the return of the people to the land, but it also includes Chronicles, which is a rewrite of Samuel and Kings, except it begins with Adam at creation to the end of Jerusalem and has a little bit more positive message for the people. The last book of the collection refers to creation, and the first book begins at creation. Then when we look at the Christian Old Testament, on the other side, we have for the first 5 books, which we typically call Law or the Pentateuch. It's the same category as the Law or Torah in the Tanakh, the 5 books of Moses. Then we have our next category, which is the historical books, and that is basically begins with Joshua, and that runs through Chronicles. In other words, we take all the historical narratives and we put them together into a chain that are arranged based upon the period of time that they tell about. And then we have the wisdom and poetic books, which begins with Job, and then also has with it Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. And these are basically the lyrical works that are found within the writings of the Jewish Bible. And then we have the prophetic works, and these are mostly the oracular works that we find in the latter prophets. And this is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and then also the 12 minor prophets. But that is the categories that we find there. Now, the New Testament anthology is a little different. There's not as two different arrangements. There's not as much controversy around it, and so you have this as the New Testament anthology. The New Testament anthology has with it first 4 books of the New Testament, which were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is one historical book, and that's the book of Acts, and it records the birth of the church and its beginnings. And then you also have the epistles. Epistles is another word for letter. And then within the epistles, you have 2 basic categories, Pauline epistles and general epistles. The Pauline epistles basically begin in Romans and goes through Philemon. The general epistles begin with Hebrews and goes through Jude. And then there's one apocalyptic book, the book of Revelation. This shows you the basic collections of books that are found in the Bible. And whether you accept it as a religious canon or not, you still have to deal with it as a anthology of works that have been related to one another and have some sort of coherence within them. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.